Morning, folks, and welcome to today's episode called Leon Black, Master of the Universe Undone. Black made billions with junk bonds, complex financial engineering, buying bankrupt companies and turning them around. He was aggressive, ruthless, and very, very good at what he did. He was Michael Milken's right-hand man, and after Milken went to jail, Black built Apollo, an asset manager now overseeing over $850 billion. He bought the painting The Scream for $120 million, and now he's forced to explain why he paid Jeffrey Epstein $158 million after Epstein had served jail time. It's a cracking episode. Enjoy. So, Leon Black was born in 1951 into a pretty wealthy family in Manhattan. His father, Eli Black, is a very, very interesting character. So he was a Polish immigrant from a poor background. He was a rabbi for 3 years, but then he moved into finance, first working for Lehman Brothers and then becoming CEO of this obscure company called AMK. It made caps for milk bottles. But this was in the mid-60s. Conglomerates were becoming the big thing in business, and Eli got in on the act. He created his own sprawling billion-dollar conglomerate called United Brands. It included this huge meatpacking company as well as United Fruit, a story that we have covered. I don't know if we've released it yet. So United Fruit was a company that we now know as Chiquita, and it was one of, and still is, one of the largest banana importers in the USA. Leon's mother was an artist, his aunt owned an art gallery, so art and business were the two big influences in his life. He was an excellent student, graduated with highest honours from Dartmouth in 1973 with a degree in philosophy and history. And then he went to Harvard Business School. But it was while he was there, in February 1975, that a seismic and tragic event unfolded. So let's circle back to his father, Eli, who I did say was a very interesting character. Well, his company, United Brands, was by 1975 under massive financial pressure for lots of different reasons. A hurricane had ripped through Honduras the previous year, wiping out the banana crop. Governments in South America were imposing huge taxes on bananas. And added to all this, Eli Black was under investigation for bribing the president of Honduras. So on February 3rd, 1975, he was chauffeur-driven from his Park Avenue apartment to his offices on the 44th floor in the Pan Am building. He removed his hat and coat and then used his heavy attaché case to smash the window before carefully removing any jagged pieces to ensure he didn't cut himself. And then he jumped. It was, without doubt, one of the most public and shocking suicides that Wall Street had seen, making front page news. And not only that, but of course the bribery scandal that he was also caught up in made headlines. It was dubbed Bananagate. I mean, you can only imagine the impact this had on the now 25-year-old Leon, who, by all accounts, idolised his father. In an interview that I listened to from 2020, Black mentioned how he and his father read philosophy together, how his father instilled in him a love of Shakespeare. So he really idolised his father, and his father's death and the nature of it, it must have had a very, very big and lasting impact on Black's life. So this was the mid-70s. Wall Street was just emerging from a market crash. Jobs were scarce. Black applied to Lehman Brothers, where his father had worked, only to be told he didn't have the brains or the personality for Wall Street. Now, he had a few jobs before eventually landing at Drexel, Burnham, Lambert. Now, at that time, Drexel, it was a second-tier firm. But that was about to change because out in California, they had an emerging star employee called Michael Milken. And he was building this revolutionary new business around what became known as junk bonds. Now, I've never really been clear what bonds or junk bonds were, so I did a little bit of research. This is as much for my own knowledge as for yours. So let's look at first what a bond is. A bond is basically an IOU. A company needs money, so instead of going to a bank, it borrows from investors by selling them bonds. The company promises to pay interest regularly and give back the full amount later. Junk bonds then are bonds issued by companies that aren't very safe bets. Maybe they're already in debt, or maybe they're pretty new companies. Whatever the reason, credit rating agencies flag them as below investment grade. And because of that, the only way these companies can convince people to lend them the money is by offering very high interest rates. So Milken, he almost single-handedly grew this junk bond sector, like to such an extent that it literally revolutionized corporate finance by providing huge amounts of cheap capital that then went on to fund corporate raiders throughout the 70s and early 80s. So the big corporate raiders that we know of from back then, I'm talking Carl Icahn, Sir James Goldsmith, Nelson Peltz, and of course the fantastically named T. Boone's Pickens. I'm definitely doing an episode on him. All of these guys financed their raids using Milken's junk bonds, and they transformed corporate America. And Milken's true genius wasn't only in seeing the potential of these junk bonds, but also building the pipeline, matching raiders who needed money with investors hungry for high returns, and packaging it in a way that Wall Street had never done before. And Black, who was in his early 30s at this stage, and by now was head of mergers and acquisitions at Drexel, he was taking Milken's junk bonds and funding them into deals in New York because, as I said, Milken was back in California. Black was very sharp, and while in interviews that I've seen with him, he comes across as very mild-mannered, very boring. At work, he was known for being super aggressive with a very, very hot temper. So by the mid-1980s, Drexel was the number one player in the hostile takeover boom. And here's a quote from Black in a 2005 article reflecting on that time. There was fear everywhere. Every CEO was worried. They'd read the Wall Street Journal in the morning and learn that their company was under attack by some guy we'd financed for $10 billion that morning. Nobody felt safe. Well, I'm guessing that Black and Milken felt pretty unsafe when on November 14th, 1986, the SEC stunned Wall Street when they announced that Ivan Boesky, who at this stage was perhaps one of the most high-profile speculators on Wall Street, and who also happened to be a very close business associate of Michael Milken, and together with Milken was up to all kinds of shenanigans, well, the SEC announced that he had pleaded guilty to insider trading and, crucially, he'd agreed to cooperate with investigators. Now, Boesky has featured in other stories that I've covered. It was as a result of his testimony that the lid was blown on the Guinness share price scandal that led to the imprisonment of Guinness CEO Ernest Saunders. We covered that in our two-parter on Guinness. Gordon Gekko, the villain in Oliver Stone's movie Wall Street, was loosely based on Boesky. And that famous line, "Greed is good," that came straight from a university commencement speech that Boesky gave in 1986, where he told students, "I think greed is healthy. You can be greedy and still feel good about yourself." Now, I am definitely going to be doing an episode on Milken, but if you want to get a really deep dive into this whole scandal, there are two fantastic books that I read years ago. There's The Predator's Ball by Connie Brook and Den of Thieves by James B. Stewart. Now, through 1987 and 1988, a grand jury was probing Michael Milken's unit, was probing Drexel, and was finding all kinds of insider trading and bad stuff going on in there. But business was still booming. The firm posted record profits. Milken's compensation in 1987 was $550 million. And while I couldn't find any figures for Black's earnings, I'm sure that while it wasn't anywhere near what Milken was making, because Milken was the kingpin, he was the rainmaker, it is safe to assume that Black was earning millions at that time. But by the end of 1988, the party was coming to an end. The junk bond market had crashed. The investigations were reaching conclusions and they weren't very favourable. And so Drexel's leadership wanted to cut a deal with prosecutors. Part of that deal included Milken's removal. Black was Milken's loudest defender and he threatened to resign if Milken was fired and hung out to dry. But that's what happened anyway. Drexel fired Milken and made a settlement in early 1989. They pleaded guilty to 6 felony counts of securities fraud and mail fraud and had to pay $650 million in fines, the largest penalty ever imposed on a securities house at that time. Milken was indicted on 98 counts, from racketeering, securities fraud, and lots more. Black, though, avoided prosecution. And despite his earlier threat, Black stayed at Drexel. But by now, the company, it was in a debt spiral. Revenue had collapsed, its reputation was in ruins, executives, they were leaving in their droves, and Drexel were so desperate to hold on to Black that despite their precarious financial position, they paid him a bonus of 16.5 million, bringing his total compensation that year to over $20 million, making him the highest paid person in the company at just 38 years of age. In 1990, Milken pleaded guilty to 6 counts of securities and tax violations, and between civil lawsuits and fines, he paid out over $1 billion and he ended up serving 22 months in jail. Also in 1990, Drexel filed for bankruptcy. So Black, together with a few other Drexel executives, he went off and set up Apollo. And Credit Lyonnais, a state-owned French bank, came to him looking to do mergers and acquisitions. But Black told them that the M&A market was dead because that was the state of the market at that time. But he did recommend that they go into business together buying loans. You see, when the junk bond market crashed, many of the companies it had fueled were in trouble. So Black saw an opportunity. Basically, the junk bonds that Black had sold high while at Drexel, he was now going to buy low at Apollo. And that gave him 2 options. If the company whose debt he bought thrived, he could resell the debt and make a big profit. Or if the companies didn't do well, he could swap the debt for big chunks of stock and take control. And this is key to Black's overall success. He's very good at reading, at understanding volatile markets, and then working out how to profit from them. And here's a quote from him. "We've actually made most of our money during recessions. Everybody else is running for the doors, and we're backing up the trucks." And of course, this makes total sense. It's not rocket science. The best time to make huge profits is when the markets are at their lowest. But of course, most investors and banks and investment firms will have lost so much as a result of the crash that they just can't reinvest. That's the nature of boom and bust cycles. Forgive the quick interruption, but I want to let you know about our subscription service. For just $1.99 a month, you get every weekly episode completely ad-free, so you can enjoy the story without any interruptions. Subscribers also unlock a library of special episodes from when Keith was still co-hosting with me, including a 3-part deep dive on Disney and a 2-parter on Guinness. They're brilliant. Now, Keith isn't part of the show anymore, but I still have a good few hour-long episodes that I recorded with him, and they're going to be released on the 1st of every month over the next few months, again, for subscribers only. All of that for just $1.99 a month. If you'd like to join, it's really simple. On Spotify, just tap on the little lock symbol next to the bonus episodes in the feed. On Apple Podcasts, click on the show and you'll see the option to subscribe. Or if you prefer Patreon, head to patreon.com/Great Business Stories. There's also a link in the About section at the top of the podcast page to the Patreon page. And of course, if subscribing isn't for you right now, that's grand. Following the show and telling a friend about it is a huge help. Alright, back to the story. So, with the backing of Credit Lyonnais, Apollo's first big deal was when they bought the loans of Executive Life. This was a California insurer that had been one of Milken's biggest clients. By 1991, it had collapsed and their junk bond portfolio had a face value of about $6 billion, but Apollo bought it for just $3.25 billion. Because Black knew that the value of the portfolio would go up once the bond market stabilised. And he was right. Within 2 years, the portfolio was worth over $5 billion. Now, as it grew, Apollo also built a reputation for pulling companies out of bankruptcy and building them back up. Some of their more notable early successes include Samsonite. It cost them $106 million and was eventually sold for $1.7 billion. They had big successes with Allied Waste, Telemundo, Vail Resort, and many, many more. Now, by the early 2000s, because of their success, most of the founding partners had left Apollo and set up competing firms, leaving Black in charge. But helping him grow Apollo were 2 younger and very, very sharp protégés who had worked under him at Drexel, Josh Harris and Mark Rowan. Harris is an aggressive, tightly wound deal maker, while Rowan is a far more I suppose, cerebral, brilliant financial engineer, and he has a real knack for creative problem solving. And for a long time, though, Black had refused to share equity with them, but fearing that they would also go, that Harris and Rowan would leave like some of the other founding partners, and also acknowledging, I suppose, the central roles they were playing in Apollo's success. In 2007, they did get equity, and they were later named as co-founding partners. So Apollo's success over the last 25 years has been shared. That's important to say. It's not been all down to Black alone. On Wall Street, Apollo, it earned a reputation as the grim reaper of private equity. While other private equity firms like KKR and Blackstone, they bought stable businesses, Apollo bought a lot of trouble and a lot of risk. They loaded companies with debt, they cut costs to the bone, and they tried to extract value. But it hasn't always gone their way. And Black's timing and, I suppose, ability to read the markets, it hasn't always been spot on. In 2006 and 2007, they made some very big investments, buying into Harris Entertainment, the owners of Caesars Casinos, Claire's, Linens and Things. They paid top dollar because, remember, this was at the height of the financial bubble. And of course, that burst massively, spectacularly in 2008. And now these highly leveraged companies were in huge trouble. Linens and Things went bankrupt, Claire struggled, and the 30 billion buyout of Caesar's Palace collapsed under debt, and that debacle dragged on for years and years. I'm actually reading a book at the moment called The Caesar's Palace Coup. It outlines in great detail the, I suppose, aggressive and definitely very, very questionable financial restructuring methods that Apollo used in the Caesars deal. And while they booked significant losses from those boom time acquisitions, through their aggressive and very controversial tactics and some very complicated financial engineering, they definitely minimized their losses. But, as I said, Black is very good at understanding that every crisis brings with it opportunities. And so, while in 2008 others panicked, Apollo raised 20 billion and bought up distressed assets that banks were unloading at fire sale prices. Also, as a result of the crash, tighter regulations, they limited how much risk traditional banks could take on their balance sheets. So, of course, Apollo, they sensed an opportunity. They stepped in, providing lending and credit services that look a lot like what banks do, but without being regulated as tightly as banks. It's known as shadow banking. And this side of Apollo's business has grown from 20 billion in 2008 to about 400 billion in 2024. In 2011, the company floated. Black's stake was valued at over $1 billion, and this has grown exponentially over the last 4 years. Now, one of the investments that I really liked was when they took over Hostess Brands. This is the company behind Twinkies. It went bankrupt in 2012. Apollo bought it for $410 million. They invested another $250 million, but of course, most of it was financed with debt. Their equity investment was only $186 million in total. But they put the right people in place, turned it round, and sold it a few years later for $2.3 billion. And why I mention this particular company, what I like about this investment, is that it's something tangible. You know, they bought an iconic brand that was on its knees and turned it round. I mean, brilliant. Because most of Apollo's business now, it just seems like a whole load of boring financial stuff. Like private equity is responsible for just 25% of the firm today, while the remainder is dedicated to life annuities, reinsurance, and the alternative creditor, or shadow banking as it's called. But I mean, what they are doing, it's been great for the company and definitely for the three main partners. At the time of recording, Mark Rowan, who is now the CEO of the company, he has a net worth of $8 billion. Josh Harris has a net worth of $11 billion. His additional wealth comes from his ownership or part ownership of sports teams. The Washington Commander NFL team, the Philadelphia 79ers in the NBA, the New Jersey Devils in NHL, and interestingly, because I'm from Ireland and we follow the Premiership, he also owns Crystal Palace in the Premier League, or at least part owns. Leon Black's current net worth is $14 billion. So, what is Black spending all this money on? Well, I mentioned that he was very influenced by his mother and his aunt when he was young. They were artists and owned an art gallery, so art is a big thing for him. And now picture this scene. It's 2012, Sotheby's, May 2nd, New York. And Edward Munch's The Scream is up for sale. I didn't know this, but there are actually 4 versions of this painting. And this one that was up for sale is the only one that's in private hands. So the auction kicks off at $40 million. 5 bidders jump in. Then the price pushes past $80 million. Just Black and one other remain. The hammer drops at $119.9 million. And it's for Black. And at that time, it is the most expensive artwork ever sold at auction. Black, of course, has one of the most prized art collections in the world, valued at over $1 billion. It includes Van Gogh, Raphael, Cézanne, Turner, many, many more. And of course, with all this wealth comes prestige. In 2018, Black became chairman of the Museum of Modern Art after donating $40 million to its expansion. So we're moving into the 2020s, and as you can tell, Black is at the very, very height of his powers. He is, without doubt, one of Wall Street's masters of the universe. Revered and feared in business, while also sitting at the top table in terms of New York's cultural and social elite. And then it all comes crashing down. October 13th, 2020, the New York Times report that Black has paid Jeffrey Epstein at least $50 million since 2008. In other words, after Epstein had been convicted for soliciting prostitution from a teenage girl. Now, as a result of this story, Apollo's board hired a law firm to investigate, and the findings were even worse than what had been reported in the New York Times article, because this report showed that between 2012 and 2017, Black had actually paid Epstein $158 million, as well as giving him a $30 million loan. All of the money came from Black's personal coffers. None of it came from Apollo. So let's look at the facts of this case. Initially, in 2019, when Epstein died and rumours about Black's relationship with him first surfaced, Black said that he had a very limited relationship with Epstein. That was not true, because as more information came out, Black acknowledged that he knew Epstein since the mid-1990s. Details from Epstein's calendar show that Black had over 100 meetings with him since Epstein's release from 2008. So he had more scheduled meetings with Epstein than anyone else. And the meetings were at Epstein's mansion or at Black's offices. So they weren't secret meetings. The relationship started to deteriorate in 2016. It was over a dispute about fees that Epstein said were owed him, and they stopped communicating with each other in 2018. In relation to Epstein's 2008 conviction for soliciting prostitution from a teenage girl, Black said that he felt that Epstein had served his time and deserved a second chance. Then in relation to the actual $158 million in payments that Black had made to Epstein, the report commissioned by the board of Apollo found that Epstein's advice was worth anywhere from $1 billion to $2 billion in tax savings for Black. And the report found that Epstein had provided legitimate advice on trust and estate planning, tax issues, and other matters related to Black's art collection, other subjects. So it found nothing illegal transpired between Black and Epstein. However, the report conceded that the compensation that Black had paid Epstein far exceeded any amounts paid to his other professional advisors. And those payments were made through a very elaborate web of shell companies. So none of this looks good, obviously. And in an excellent podcast from Tortoise Media on Epstein's relationship with Black, the point was made that Black could have gotten tax advice from a slew of very experienced tax professionals, and that Epstein was not trained as a tax expert. William D. Cohen, a writer who I like a lot, he made the same point in an article in Vanity Fair. And it's true. Epstein had zero qualifications when it came to tax advice. But then there was a very good article in the New York Times which dug into exactly how Epstein made his money. And they interviewed people who had worked with Epstein, including an unnamed tech executive who Epstein had helped on a tax matter, and they all confirmed that Epstein only worked for very wealthy people and usually charged 10% of the tax savings. So, incredible as it may seem, this appears to be the main way that Epstein made his money. So, if, and this is a big if he saved Black 1 billion to 2 billion, and it must be said that the facts on these huge savings aren't very clear, but let's call it, let's say he did save him 1.5 billion and took a 10% fee. Then that $158 million payment could make sense. Except, of course, as William D. Cohn points out in his article, most people find all this very hard to believe. But at the same time, there is zero evidence coming to the fore that explains what else these payments might have been for. And if some of you out there are thinking, well, sex or blackmail linked to sex, well, in relation to Black, the facts don't really support this. Black and his wife socialised with Epstein. Black brought Epstein into his family home. In the Tortoise podcast, they said that Black visited Epstein on his island twice. And on both occasions, he was accompanied by his wife and one or more of his children. Now, and I know I'm getting into the details here, but the details are important here. 3 very serious allegations were made against Black after this story broke. The first was from a Russian woman who accused him of abuse. Black admitted to having had an affair with her. He had already paid her $10 million since 2015 to keep quiet and was now accusing her of blackmailing him. This woman's case was dismissed. Case number 2. In 2022, a woman accused him of raping her in Jeffrey Epstein's New York townhouse. The case was, and I quote, discontinued with prejudice and without costs to any party as against the other. Now, the phrasing of this is very particular and important because based on my research and other media reporting on this, what that phrase means is that Black did not make any payment to settle that case. And then the third case, in 2023, there was a third rape claim, but that charge is also pretty problematic. For example, the law firm representing this woman withdrew from the case just days before a key hearing in 2025. And this is very important, that same law firm had also represented the other 2 women who had made charges against Black that were either dismissed or discontinued. And Black is now pursuing a malicious prosecution lawsuit against that law firm. So I'm not seeing any sex angle in relation to Epstein and Black. Now, William D. Cohn's excellent article from Vanity Fair, he quotes Wall Street insiders saying that the report commissioned by Apollo was a whitewash. Now, my problem with this theory is that Black wasn't the only billionaire with skin in the game here. His 2 Apollo partners, Rowan and Harris, are massively wealthy, massively powerful in their own right, and crucially, the 3 of them have never been particularly close. Indeed, Harris and Black have had a very, very bitter falling out. And because Apollo had nothing to do with Epstein, it's very much not in Rowan's and Harris's interest to bury anything that could come back to severely damage them financially and reputationally. So it just doesn't add up that they would commission a report to whitewash Black. Doesn't add up. So if this all makes it look like I'm taking Black's side, I'm not. Epstein was a deplorable character, and there has to be huge question marks hanging over the heads of all individuals, Black, Bill Gates, everyone who continued to associate with Epstein after they knew of his 2008 conviction, without doubt. But for now, based on the facts that we have at the moment, the nature of Black's relationship with Epstein raises a lot of questions and has resulted in a huge amount of conjecture and speculation. But that's all. Now, of course, as a result of all this scandal, Black was forced out of Apollo. He withdrew from public life. I mean, yes, he's still very wealthy, but the power, the prestige, they're gone. And for a man who loves Shakespeare, his fall, it is Shakespearean, because Black lived in the shadow of his father's dramatic and scandalous death, And this is purely conjecture, but I'm sure that he vowed that his own life would be remembered for his achievements, not for a shameful ending. And yes, in many ways, his fate, it mirrors his father's, because despite all his wealth, his influence, his accomplishments, Black will likely be remembered for the scandal that brought him down. It's a fascinating story. And with that, let me get to an email from Sigurd. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Who would like me to do a story on Sir James Goldsmith. Coincidentally, I just mentioned him in this story. He was one of the corporate raiders who made great use of Michael Milken's junk bonds. And Goldsmith, he led a fascinating life. It is a top-notch story suggestion, so thank you, Sigurd, and watch this space. And remember, if you have any comments, any questions, or any story that you'd like us to cover, email me at info@gbspod.com. All the best, folks.